He's spoken at conferences across the globe, and it turns out he's also the author for a very commonly used textbook on intrusion detection systems, practical intrusion analysis. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Alex. I could keep talking about him all day, right? So Alex, take it away, man. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you.
There you go.
Sorry about that. So I'll be brief on the introduction since you've already given some of that. Basically, I describe myself as a commercial open source security guy since I've been at a string of 3 companies now that were the commercial implementation of open source projects from Snort to Nessus to now Zeek and Suricata. I, as mentioned, spent 10 years on the research side of the house. I've come down into the field to be a practitioner, everything from sales engineer at Cisco for major enterprise accounts to a lot of consulting work that I'm doing for Corelight these days. And I've been a frequent presenter at these venues over the course of the last decade or so. And, hopefully that means that I know how to make this entertaining and interesting for you. Prepare to actually perhaps laugh a little bit as I do sprinkle some humor in through all of this, which of course is necessary because, this is the second year in a row that the poor information security teams got hosed right as the holidays were coming at them. Sunburst, of course, we all remember was announced on December 8th of 2020, whereas Log4j showed up on December 9th, 2021. It's enough to make even the most logical of us a bit superstitious. And the thing this year is that, last year's attack was really over by the time that it started. The advanced attackers who had broken into these enterprises through their SolarWinds devices, they knew that they had to burn down all their infrastructure. Their techniques had been figured out. They had to have a different way in. Whereas Log4j is something that is going to be used by every Tom, Dick, and Harry on the internet. And so the problem has gone exponentially worse since it was first announced. Thankfully for a lot of practitioners out there, we're also reaching the point in the curve where they've got things locked down and figured out on their side. But for all of those of you who are still patching or are still figuring out what your detection methodologies are, we're going to talk today about how to make those as practical and straightforward as possible so that you can have this turn into hopefully a minor footnote as opposed to something that is on the front of your radar every day. So of course, one of the big questions that a lot of organizations had as this came out, and it's something that, our last presenter was alluding to, it's the basics of hygiene and understanding my environment. And the reality of it is that a lot of places where Log4j shows up are something like this, that was sort of shamelessly memed out of an XKCD cartoon on the subject. But, it's a very popular framework that is widely used across everything from Minecraft to, enterprise ordering systems. But it's also a sub package to a whole bunch of other popular packages. Google went out and did some analysis on how many packages within the main Java marketplace incorporated a vulnerable version of Log4j and found that it was at least 17,000 different packages had that vulnerability present in them through inclusion of a vulnerable version of Log4j. And just to make things extra fun, it's apparently very popular in embedded firmware for IoT devices. Which means that it could be years before you're getting into a patch cycle that lets you take this out of an industrial environment or some other sort of highly regulated IoT setup, or perhaps leave it open if you've just got household IoT showing up in the environment. Unfortunately, that practice leaves us in a situation where this is a problem that folks have to actually think about across a whole range of devices and not just Windows boxes or SolarWinds systems, as the case might be. And thankfully, given how widespread this is, there are plenty of places that turned out to not be vulnerable simply because version 1.x of Log4j didn't have the functionality in there that led to this bug, and so they were completely unaffected. And while you may think of that as something that is only for neglected chunks of infrastructure and people who are somehow terribly behind where they ought to be in their development cycles, Corelight actually runs an old version of Log4j on our systems. And the reality around that is that, logging as a technology is not changing that much. There haven't been that many great innovations in the space. And because we're building a product that, again, has to get through a lot of regulatory compliance and auditing in order for us to sell to the federal government here in the States, and other certifications, especially as we move things into the cloud. The effort of having to go and validate a new package that does something only marginally better than something we had before just isn't there. And in this case, it saved us the hassle, of course, of having to patch our systems as well. But it's a reality that, again, thankfully helped mitigate this for a number of large enterprises out there. But the reason, of course, that everybody has to worry so much about all of this is just how easy this thing is to exploit at the end of the day. You can put an exploit string in a huge range of different places, everything from user agent strings and URIs to SMTP envelopes. Really anything that gets logged is fair game for this thing. And the actual Java code that is going to be loaded by vulnerable systems is not something that you need to actually understand how to program in Java to be able to deploy on a victim system. It's much too easy to go to whatever dark web forum and pick up off-the-shelf remote access Trojans and other types of malware written in Java, ready to go for a couple of $100s. So the barrier to entry is super low. And of course, it's also something that attackers can really just scan the whole internet for broadly. It doesn't matter that they establish any kind of connection or authentication or anything like that. You can just spam every URL you find on the internet until you get a 200 OK and a load of things. And what helped a lot of the defenders at first is, it looked like it was going to be something that was super trivial to actually detect in the wild, because of the fact that, hey, JNDI LDAP is a string that you only see in one context, and it is this specific context. And of course, detection technologies, the more specific a string is, the faster they can operate, the better they can hone in on things. And of course, that string has no business showing up inside of a normal HTTP header. There is nothing about a regular application that is going to do that inside of HTTP. And because of this, all of these security vendors out there in the landscape were totally on the ball with their detections. A lot of places had things out within a matter of hours from announcement of the vulnerability. And at first, it sort of seemed like, okay, well, we're just going to be able to block this at the perimeter with something that's a high confidence detection and not worry about things too much until we get things patched. But the problem, of course, is because this is so trivial to exploit, and because there were so many people paying attention to it as it got dropped, the sheer volume of alerts that started to come into different organizations got totally out of control very fast. One of the things we've got at Corelight is something we call our Polaris Research Network, where we've placed sensors into customer environments and got access to actually crunch through their data to validate our detections and tune things ourselves. And what I found on just one sensor out of 3 at one major enterprise environment was on the first day that the news was out, there were 64 of those JNDI LDAP attempts running through that environment. But the next day it was up a couple orders of magnitude to 1,200. The next day, suddenly we were at 4,200. The day after that, we're up another order of magnitude at 22,000. And by the time we were 5 days out from this vulnerability being announced, we were up to 143,000 JNDI LDAP attempts against one corner of this enterprise. And so you can imagine there's no way that any set of humans is going to be able to dig through that level of alerts with any confidence or speed on their own. Now, before I dive into some of the ways that teams are successfully, dealing with that volume of alerts, from a more interesting automated basis, I'm going to have to go and make a public service announcement that it amazes me I have to make here in 2022. And that is to turn off alerts on your IDS for your vulnerability scanners. They are doing nothing but generating noise for your SOC and making the volume problem worse. Because, you know, look, it's a good thing to run vulnerability scanners inside of your environment. In fact, given the dependencies, you know, that Log4j was inside of so many different software packages, being able to scan more frequently than the typical 30-day windows that organizations have to determine their level of vulnerability was a critical kind of a first step in organizations assessing and getting things under control. But there's no reason that they shouldn't take the couple of minutes necessary to identify the IP addresses where all these sweeps are coming from and mute those on the IDS so that volume of noise is dramatically reduced for the people who have to actually process these things. Now, one of the other reasons that it's so important to do that profiling is that it allows you to do matching against hosts that are known to be vulnerable to something like this and attacks as they're coming in. And that's something that we at Corelight have done very specifically with our Suricata implementation, where we've now got the ability to reach out to your Tenables, your Rapid7s, your Qualyses, get that data about which systems are known to be vulnerable to which CVEs. And then in the event that a alert fires against one of these CVEs, look it up and say, oh yeah, that box is actually vulnerable. And you need to prioritize that to the top of the list of things that you're going to go through today. So that level of understanding of your environment is going to be another one of those key sort of background setup pieces that are going to let you cut through the volume of noise and get to the things that actually matter at the end of the day. And now, you know, some of you might be saying, well, that's great that you're able to do that mapping directly on your sensor, but I can do that in my SIM as well. So, you know, why do I care? And the answer to that is that most of the folks who are doing SIM operations today are putting it together in a manner that looks a lot like this, where they're pulling logs off of a whole variety of application servers, network devices, you know, security devices, and trying to munge all of that data into a coherent picture on the far side. And while there are certainly vendor-driven schemas like Splunk's Common Information Model or the Elastic Common schema that are going to assist in the process of turning all these disparate sources into coherent, unified sort of a picture, there are, you know, let's put it this way. One of my colleagues here at Corelight came from a large financial prior to joining us, and they had a project to do this normalization that had taken 7 years by the time that he left. And the worst part about it, of course, is that at the end of those 7 years, some of these sources of data had changed because of other pressures in the business causing them to switch vendors. And so they were busy restarting that project as he left. Now that may be an extreme example of organizational difficulty in normalizing data. It's not necessarily orders of magnitude off of what we see across a broad variety of customers out in the wild. And so anytime that you can be bringing on data sources that are more pre-integrated, that are designed for you to be able to get at the data you want instead of having to transform it, the easier time you're going to have actually doing operations day to day in the SOC. And to really kind of put this in perspective, I like to use this pyramid of SOC capabilities that was written by Matt Swan, who's a chief security architect over at Microsoft. And it's obvious, but I think useful to remember that, you know, you first have to start with that level of asset inventory in your environment. You've got to know what you're defending in order to be able to defend it. But more importantly, the linkage between detection and telemetry is super critical for folks who are attempting to do anything useful with these detections. Because if you're able to take you know, all of these sweeps that are running across the internet trying to hit Log4j over HTTP, and are able to very quickly pull up and find out that, oh, well, all of those came back as 404s from the servers that were being shot at. Then you can easily automate the process of plowing through all of those pieces of noise and just focus on the times where a successful response came back and later connections were made. And, you know, doing that triage of, okay, this, you know, exploit attempt actually came back as a success from that host. What did it do? Did it pull down that nasty piece of Java? Did it make C2 connections after that? Is again very reliant on having that telemetry about what's going on in your environment. And if you don't have that in a format that you can easily reach, that you can, you know, get to without having to correlate a whole bunch of different sources and hope that timestamps aren't going to mess everything up, then you're going to have a real hard time dealing with something that can shoot into the millions of alerts per day, especially in larger enterprise networks. And to just sort of remind you of, you know, how important it is to tie all these bits of telemetry together. You know, when we have that initial attack that comes into that vulnerable system, it's going to have to make a secondary call to pull malicious Java code back down to that system before it actually spits anything out the far side that is malicious. Typical alerting systems are going to see this initial attack, but be completely blind to the details of that secondary connection that gets pulled down. And so you need to be able to pull together the records of what happened on your network along with those alerts in order to be able to determine which ones actually turned out to operationally be a problem. You know, and again, doing all of this on an automated basis is really the goal that you're going to want to be going after as an analyst. And whether that's done in an off-the-shelf tool like a Splunk Phantom or is implemented in whatever custom programming language you may choose for your in-house tooling, the ability to go back to your data very quickly, link that alert with that telemetry and determine what happened, what was pulled down, you know, what type of malware was just dropped on that box is critical to being able to triage the successful attacks out from the pile of noise that is all the scanners out on the internet. And, you know, to demonstrate that a little bit from a data simplicity perspective, one of the things that we put out early on at Corelight publicly was a single query that we're able to put together inside of a system like Splunk, as shown here, but feasible in any SIM that has reasonably complex data processing language. We're able to say, hey, when there is a hit against the detection for Log4j, let's pull out the IP address and port of the device that is hosting the malicious code and do a search for connections to that directly inside of our con log, which is our layer flow connection log, similar to a NetFlow, and be able to pull out in a single query all the systems that were actually making connections outbound to pull down malicious Java files after an initial exploit attempt had been shot against them. And so again, whenever you can make it easier for analysts to be able to unify data and put queries together that are simple and yield broader logic that you need, you know, simply the faster they're going to be able to move through what is often an, you know, unconscionably large pile of alerts coming out of regular detection. And now that, of course, doesn't even account for the fact that there have been a series of obfuscations that have been applied to that attack string since it was first put out there in the wild. There are a million different ways to skin a string in Java. And it's no surprise that a language as complete as Java allows you to put those all together in a variety of different formats. And even, you know, this is something where attackers can put multiple exploit attempts into a single HTTP, SMTP, you have it request. And so there's, the defenders now have to account for, looking for these strings across multiple places in a given packet in multiple different ways inside of a packet. Heaven help you too, of course, if the initial attack is SSL encrypted and you don't have man-in-the-middle decrypt to be able to get the plain text HTTP that's sitting in your servers. And that has, continued to grow, obviously, as attackers do the cat and mouse game of trying to evade new detections laid down by vendors doing detections out in the wild. And of course, that has only led to the alert volumes coming off of these tools being even higher than in those initial several days that I talked about earlier. It really boils down to the fact that when you account for all the different ways that Java can obfuscate things, you've really only got a single constant string left that you can search for of $ bracket. And while something like that certainly should never show up inside of a user agent string, for example, it will show up all the time in URIs and other HTTP headers. And it means really that the number of completely false positives that are not validly formed exploit attempts at all that are being alerted on has continued to go up for all but the most delicately tuned alerting systems. And so that has really led some defenders to look to broader sort of anomaly detection techniques here. For example, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can do a Java network directory interface lookup. But in reality, how often are you ever going to download Java over LDAP in a normal environment? There are a whole lot of these features that are programmed into languages like Java that folks just aren't using in the wild because they don't even know they exist. Certainly when you get into things that are more obscure like remote machine interface or IIOP their mere presence is something that is potentially worth paying attention to. DNS text records, as another example, are something that are going to show up normally in regular enterprise environments, but can easily be differentiated by the presence of JNDI LDAP itself or some sort of obfuscated Java string that, again, simply doesn't belong in those records in the wild. And so, I would encourage folks to go check out the Corelight blog. We've published a couple of entries about different ways that we're looking for anomalies that can be associated to successful Log4j attacks that are not detectable for whatever obfuscation reason on the front end, be it encryption or some novel technique that someone has come up with in that Turing complete programming language. Now, one of the things too that brings us back to mitigations that we can use out in the wild is, if Java being loaded over LDAP is not something that we ever expect to see in our environment, maybe we should just go ahead and block that at the firewall, right? Instead of worrying about detecting it post facto. Well, the hard part in the cloud is that most modern EC2 instances don't use any sort of a VPC transit across the firewall. They're designed to be delivering services near where they're needed and not having choke point architectures that were points of failure in on-premise networks. And so what that leaves those systems with in terms of trying to block things from a security perspective is things like cloud native security groups in AWS. And by the way, I'm picking on Amazon here because they're so widely deployed, but this applies in principle to the other cloud providers as well. The problem with those security groups is that they're port-based. If you select that you want to block LDAP, it's going to default to port 389 and not be something that you can actually change. The reality of it is I think we all in this room know that it's really easy for somebody to send one protocol across a port that is RFC'd for another. And certainly we've seen plenty of cases in our research network of LDAP being conducted over port 443 or port 80, so that folks are able to evade firewall protections like this. And so you're left in a situation where you can't properly block this on a firewall without completely redoing your entire cloud architecture. But you can at least use VPC mirroring to be able to take this data back to a monitoring device that it's going to be able to see these things when they occur and react to them in an automated way, such that the lag time between a box being popped and remediation being applied is low enough that an attacker really doesn't have a chance to do serious damage to the infrastructure. And of course, because you're in the cloud, you can then come back and immediately just deploy a new container for that image, or spin up a new AMI or whatever the case might be, and move on at the end of the day. Now, speaking again to mitigations here, patching, of course, is definitely still the most important thing that every organization can be doing. But we can kind of understand why a lot of organizations were demoralized by the sequence of vulnerabilities that showed up in Log4j. There were a whole stream of vulnerabilities that popped up after the first one began to be actively exploited in the wild. And so a lot of organizations sort of said, well, maybe I should just wait a little bit to patch because there's going to be more. Thankfully, the best that has really come up in terms of successful attacks against Log4j at this point are situations that are non-default configurations, or when an attacker actually controls a config file, which really thankfully leaves us in a situation where all of these following CVEs have not had the practical real world impact of that first one. And so, disheartening as it might be to have a whole pile of vulnerabilities to go and patch, it is certainly still worth doing that, given the smaller impact of the later patches out in the real world. But again, those policy controls are probably one of the smartest ways to go about ensuring that these attacks have a lower total impact to them. Case in point, I have a good friend working for a major financial that's not a Corelight customer, and was talking to him about, so how bad did you get hit with all this Log4j nonsense? And he said, well, the vulnerability scan team came with a 200-page report and said everything's on fire. And I said, but don't we block outbound communication from our entire DMZ that you're telling me we need to take everything down in order to patch? And it turned out, yeah, they were able to do that with that on-premise data center. And so the attack never actually having a chance to pull down that malicious code turned out to only be so much noise for them at the end of the day. Now, in organizations where that's not feasible for whatever reason, you don't want to maintain the whitelist of update servers out there, you may certainly be able to block inbound Java files from being delivered to the organization, or at least, again, have a very selected group of organizations where that is allowed from. You might be able to disable JNDI as an interface across your systems, which is probably smart even outside of Log4j generally, since loading Java from remote locations on the internet has its whole slew of perils independent of the specific vulnerability. But I think it's very important with all of these policy controls that you're putting in place to make sure that all of the different security teams that are potentially responding to one of these events are aware of these policies, so that one group isn't spinning their wheels on something that another group knows isn't going to be relevant at the end of the day because of the way that the policy controls have been put in place. So really to sort of summarize here, what you're shooting for as a SOC is going beyond simply having alerting technologies in place. You want to be able to understand the environment and prioritize within it based upon what your true risk really is. And you want to do that in a situation where you've got telemetry that you can easily access to automate the process of validating and triaging these events so that you can take those millions of alerts that are going to show up per day in these larger environments and shrink them down to the tens or so of cases where something actually matters and you need to engage a team to go and clean things up. So that is my presentation for today. Happy to have had the opportunity to come and talk to folks. It's been pleasant. And I will certainly be available in the Slack for conversation following this. Happy to take questions if we want now. I know we still got a little bit of time designated on the schedule.
Yeah, definitely. We got about 5 minutes here. If there's anybody who's got a live question for Alex, great. Otherwise, I'm going to pitch one here. Alex, you know, that slide that you showed with the, you know, basically consolidating and indexing and understanding your telemetry sources. If you had, you know, just, I mean, I know I'm stealing some of your professional consulting, you know, secrets here, right? But like, if there's one or two things you can pitch to somebody to say, hey, here's how to start to untangle that mess. I've inherited this technical debt. What do you tell them?
Well, I mean, I'm probably biased, of course, but I would say come and take a look at Corelight because we provide complete network level detection in a format that is, you know, integrated for easy pivoting and designed to be comprehensive from a security perspective, while still lightweight enough to hang on to in the long term. So it's, you know, and I would encourage folks to do that with, you know, network, with endpoints, with all of their data sources, as much as they can consolidate those into cleaner, more purpose-built formats that are designed for security, the easier it's going to be to untangle that mess.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Total sense. And so you mentioned endpoint, so I'm going to put you on the spot here again too.
Sure.
You know, a lot of folks are really doing a big focus on endpoint, and you know, are maybe a little bit less so on networking, which is really interesting to me. But how do you integrate that data, right? If you are a strong endpoint focused shop, how do you really start integrating and weaponizing that or operationalizing that network data?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the things that the open source Zeek project that Corelight is kind of the keepers of has done intentionally out in the wild for several years now. We've got something we call community ID that is a hash that is designed to integrate with, I mean, Wireshark has adopted it. Some of the full PCAP solutions have adopted it. We're working with some of the bigger endpoint technologies in the back end to get them to integrate it as well. So having some sort of intentional linkage between the data sets, especially if it's something that's open that you can easily apply, even if it's not vendor supported, is going to really make it easier for you to be able to say, okay, well, I saw that C2 connection. Now, what was the process that initiated it?
No, that's fantastic. And by the way, you just like, it rolled so smoothly out. I fear that a lot of folks miss the word intentional in front of linkage, as opposed, you know, like by design versus just so happens that maybe we can correlate this data at the time of an emergency.
Right. Well, and that's a big part of our mission here at Corelight is we know that we're a part of a broader security ecosystem. No one tool is ever going to be able to do everything you need in InfoSec. And so, you know, a big part of our mission is to integrate as smoothly as possible with as many of the major players in the security space as we can, because you as an analyst should be spending your time analyzing data, not correlating and normalizing it.
Hallelujah. Preach, brother, preach, right? Love it, love it. Well, hey, Alex, I really appreciate you coming out here, and you and Corelight, of course, bringing this content to the SANS community. Thanks so much for this fantastic presentation.